As we all know, for nearly 2 years, the State of Israel has been committing a genocide against the people of Gaza, ostensibly in response to the October 7th attacks by Hamas. But we also know that there's a history of Israel committing genocide against the Palestinians for much longer. And it's undeniable that the U.S. has been complicit in the slaughter of Gazans by providing military aid and diplomatic support to the Zionist project for decades. But in this video, I'm going to talk about a much lesser known genocide that Israel was involved in, this time assisting Guatemala and by proxy the United States in committing one of its own. Israeli leaders would use their experience as colonizers, genociders, and oppressors of the Palestinians to help the U.S. and Guatemalan government in perpetrating one of the most horrific and forgotten crimes of the 20th century, the Mayan genocide. On May 10, 2013, former Guatemalan dictator Efrain Rios Montt was convicted for crimes against humanity perpetrated largely against the indigenous Maya population. In the early 1980s, when Rios Montt was in power, the impoverished peasant country had already endured nearly 20 years of state terror, and yet it would only get worse under his rule. In 1982 alone, tens of thousands of Mayans were brutally tortured, raped, and murdered by the Guatemalan military. Hundreds of villages were razed to the ground, and children were beaten with hammers. It was the most horrifying year of the Guatemalan Civil War. And in a revealing statement to ABC News, Rios Montt, who rose to power through a military coup, said that his takeover was such a success because many of his soldiers were trained by the Israelis. But Israel's involvement went far beyond helping Rios Montt rise to power, providing weapons, technology, and military training starting in the 1970s and escalating in lockstep with Guatemalan state terror. From 1960 to 1996, Guatemala was mired in a brutal civil war that left 200,000 dead, including 166,000 Mayan men, women, and children. What led up to the Civil War was a CIA-backed coup that ousted Guatemala's second democratically elected president, Jacobo Arbenz, in 1954. Arbenz was a liberal inspired by the New Deal programs of FDR. But what got him thrown out of office was his land redistribution program, which threatened the political and economic power of the Guatemalan elite, but even more importantly, the domination of American banana company, United Fruit. This was one of many examples during the Cold War when Third World leaders were overthrown to protect capital and pacify their populations. The Arbenz coup returned to power successive U.S.-backed military dictatorships. Unsurprisingly, these dictatorships were brutal, repressive, and corrupt. And in 1960, leftist junior military officers, fed up with the government's corruption and incompetence, led a failed revolt against President Irigoyen Fuentes. The surviving officers would go on to form revolutionary group MR-13, with other rebel groups forming in their wake. In the mid-1960s, the Guatemalan military began its counterinsurgency campaign against the leftist guerrillas. And no surprise, they were assisted by the CIA. Soon the government was disappearing their enemies and letting loose Israeli-trained death squads in the countryside. Anyone suspected of leftist sympathies, particularly Mayan peasants, became targets for annihilation. Similar to Israel's rhetoric against Palestinians, the government insisted there were no civilians in the Mayan countryside. By the late 1970s, Guatemala's human rights abuses were so atrocious that the Carter administration had to cut off military aid after failing to convince them to dial back the brutality. Israeli assistance began in the early 70s, but ramped up significantly after the U.S. pulled their support. And Israel was more than willing to do the U.S.'s dirty work. Yaakov Meridor, then the Israeli Minister of Economics, said this about the relationship with the U.S. "Don't compete with us in places where you cannot sell arms directly. Let us do it. Israel will be your intermediary." There were a few main reasons Israel was eager to play this role. One is that Israel was isolated in the international community for obvious reasons. Israeli politician Yohani Ramadi had this to say: "Israel is a pariah state. When people ask us for something, we cannot afford to ask questions about ideology. The only type of regime Israel would not aid would be one that is anti-American. Also, if we can aid a country that may be inconvenient for the U.S. to help, we would be cutting off our nose to spite our face not to." This attitude was more than appreciated by Guatemalan officials. One politician was very candid about the whole thing, saying that the Israelis don't let this human rights thing get in the way of business. You pay, they deliver. No questions asked, unlike the gringos, meaning the United States. This, of course, had the added benefit of pleasing Israel's most generous benefactor and defender, the United States. Israel scratched our back, and we scratched theirs. Another reason Israel started running guns to Guatemala and many other third world dictatorships was that the arms trade became a significant part of the Israeli economy. In the 1970s and 80s, around 20% of the industrial workforce was employed by arms exporters. Both employment and the government budget were critically tied to this industry. And lastly, Israel and Guatemala shared a special relationship going back to the founding of the Zionist state. In 1947, Jorge Garcia Granados, Guatemala's representative to the UN Special Committee on Palestine, recommended partition of Palestine into two separate states for Jews and Arabs. And in 1948, he urged Guatemala's president to immediately recognize the State of Israel. Guatemala became a key vote in the UN, supporting Israel's occupation of Palestine. And in the 1970s, both countries shared the common goal of repressing their populations, fighting for freedom. At the start of the Civil War, most rebel groups were of mixed Spanish and Mayan descent. During the 1960s, these groups were nearly wiped out by the military's first counterinsurgency campaign. But in the 1970s, the revolutionary movement gained new support from the rural indigenous population, with many new recruits coming from the countryside. This shift required the Guatemalan government to implement new counterinsurgency strategies to adjust to the new terrain. It was also around this time that Israel sought to pacify the populations of Gaza, the West Bank, and Golan Heights, territories it had seized in the 1967 war. One major way of doing this was through agriculture. The kibbutzim were farming communities built on stolen land from the Palestinians. These communities were also heavily militarized to defend themselves from uprisings spurred on by the settlements. The Guatemalan military was very impressed by the success of the kibbutzim, so impressed that they had over 1,000 people trained by Israeli advisors to implement similar systems. Agriculture became an essential aspect of the Guatemalan counterinsurgency campaign. The military, using what they learned from their Israeli education, set up so-called model villages. First, they massacred and burned down peasant villages, then anyone who was lucky enough to survive was resettled in these model villages. Under Rios Montt, the rural pacification scheme was referred to as beans and bullets. It was conceived by two high-up military officers with the help of Israeli advisors. These model villages operated under tight military control, making it nearly impossible for the resettled refugees to organize resistance against the government. The name Beans and Bullets referred to the Food for Work program and so-called civil defense patrols. If the refugees cooperated with the government, they were rewarded with food. The government also forced refugees to join civil patrols, organized and controlled by the army. Members of these patrols were armed and trained to identify subversive activity and snuff it out. The patrols were also required to hit a quota of subversives turned over to the army. If they didn't hit the quota, they were faced with torture and death. The government was forcing neighbors to turn against each other. And the parallels between the kibbutzim and the Beans and Bullets program were so obvious that Guatemalan officers described their work as the Palestinization of the Mayan countryside. All told, over 1 million people were internally displaced during the Civil War. But often there was no one left to relocate because every villager had perished at the hands of the military. One of the most infamous of these massacres happened in the village of Dos Eres. Elite special force commandos, called the Kaibiles, were trained by the Israelis to carry out these massacres. And what crime did these villagers commit? Well, the government deemed them sympathizers of the guerrilla movement, which of course meant that they were guerrillas and could be killed, even the children. The commandos forced everyone out of their homes, searched them and found no weapons or even guerrilla propaganda, but that didn't matter. The first to die was a baby who was just thrown down a well by a soldier. The children were separated from their families and killed. Pregnant women had their unborn children ripped from their wombs. The women and girls were raped by the commandos. Some were even bludgeoned to death with a hammer. Then the dead bodies were dumped in the same well that the baby was. A UN investigation found that the bullet fragments discovered at Dos Eres and dozens of other Mayan villages were from Israeli-made Galil rifles. Israeli weapons really began to flood into Guatemala in the mid-1970s after the illegitimate president made a private trip to Israel to cut an arms deal. In 1975, the first big batch of military goodies had arrived. The Guatemalans got their hands on Areva aircraft, armored cars, Uzi submachine guns, and the infamous Galil rifle. By the early 80s, Israel was supplying so much weaponry and munitions used to slaughter Mayan civilians that they decided it'd be easier if they just built an arms factory in Guatemala, which they did. The military no doubt appreciated the time saved by having their Galil rifles built in the country. But perhaps more important was that Israel's guns didn't come with strings attached. The government's human rights abuses didn't faze the Israelis one bit. They didn't faze the Reagan administration either, but Congress continued to block support for Guatemala. In fact, Reagan was kind of sweet on Rios Montt, saying the fascist dictator was getting a bum rap on human rights and was dedicated to democracy. Israel didn't just supply weapons and train death squads, they also provided the Guatemalan government high-tech gadgets to use in their counterinsurgency campaign to terrorize combatants and civilians alike. In the late 70s, Israeli tech company Tataran built the government a computer used to track subversives. The computer was built in the annex of the National Palace, where intelligence officers met to select targets. If you ended up on the list, you had a high chance of being disappeared, or worse. Some of the targets were actual guerrillas, but many were also student activists, journalists, union leaders, and leftist politicians. To sum things up, Israel provided material support to the Guatemalan government in carrying out genocide against the Maya population. They supplied weaponry and technology and trained officers on how to most efficiently eradicate the enemy. Israel did act as a proxy for the United States, yes, but also had their own selfish reasons that I discussed earlier. And their deadly support wasn't limited to Guatemala. Israel supported many fascist governments around the world. Israel was among the main suppliers of weapons to the Somoza dictatorship and later the Contras in Nicaragua. Israel also supplied weapons to the Argentine military dictatorship, in which several thousand Jews were also victims. And all of this was done to crush emancipatory movements and protect capital. Today, Israel still has a significant presence in Guatemala. For example, the Golan Group, which is a private security firm founded by Israeli ex-special forces, has been in the country for decades. The Golan Group carries on the legacy of Israeli-sponsored terror in Latin America. In 2014, the company was sued by 6 farmers who were shot while peacefully protesting a mining company encroaching on indigenous land. The bloodshed in Guatemala was justified by dehumanization and equating innocent civilians with combatants. Similarly, Israel has and continues to use genocidal rhetoric to justify their crimes against the Palestinians while exporting the means to carry out such crimes across the globe.